a single song, and suddenly, a life is lost. Welcome to Eco Misteriosa. I am your host, Urvela. Tell me, where are you listening from today? Your comments make these mysteries come alive. Let's begin the case. It was in the final week of October, in that damp and brooding season when the London fog seems to coil like a living thing through the narrow lanes and over the soot-streaked rooftops, that I found Sherlock Holmes staring out of the window of our Baker Street lodgings in one of his more impenetrable silences. The fire crackled merrily, casting long, flickering shadows upon the bookshelves, but Holmes had refused both tea and tobacco, which I took as a sign that something had disturbed the natural rhythm of his mind. "You're thinking of the Whittingham case, perhaps?" I ventured, hoping to draw him out of his abstraction. Holmes turned, his lean face illuminated only partially by the firelight. "Whittingham? No, my dear Watson. That was a mere puzzle of postal misdirection. Child's play. No, what occupies my thoughts is a sound that should never have mattered and yet may have killed a man." Before I could inquire further, the front doorbell rang with a briskness that suggested urgency. A moment later, Mrs. Hudson announced the arrival of Inspector Lestrade. Lestrade stepped into the room, brushing the drizzle from his coat and hat. "Evening, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson. I've come with a case that's got the yard rattled like a penny in a teacup." Holmes gestured toward the armchair with a languid hand. "Sit down, Lestrade. Tell us what orchestral calamity has sent you here on a Tuesday night." Lestrade sat, clearly suppressing annoyance at Holmes's tone. "There's been a murder in Clerkenwell, number 13, Ludlow Crescent. Elderly gentleman by the name of Sir Felix Simon, retired magistrate, found dead in his parlour last night, slumped over the pianoforte." Holmes perked up immediately, all previous languor vanishing. "Cause of death? No visible wounds. No sign of struggle. The doctor says apoplexy. But that doesn't sit right. The household staff say they heard a song, one specific song, being played on the piano, La Sonnerie du Soir, just before he was found. Odd thing is, no one was supposed to be in the room, and the piano's an old mechanical one. The keys were still moving when the maid entered. No sign of who started it. And then, Sir Felix, stone dead in his chair. I could not help but shiver. You believe someone used the piano roll to mask the crime?" Lestrade nodded. "Maybe. Or maybe something else entirely. But the house was locked from the inside. Only the butler and the maid were home, and they're clean as far as we can tell. No visitors, nothing stolen, no letters. Just that song. Repeating." Holmes rose, already retrieving his coat and gloves. "Watson, fetch your bag. Lestrade, you mentioned the song title. La Sonnerie du Soir. The evening chime. Curious. A military farewell, is it not?" Lestrade nodded. "Played at French army funerals, if I recall right." Holmes smiled, but there was no warmth in it. A most deliberate selection. Someone wanted that man to hear that tune before he died, and the choice suggests symbolism or vengeance. As we stepped out into the thick fog of the London night, Holmes whispered, "This is not a murder of passion or gain, Watson. It's one of performance. And somewhere behind the curtain, the conductor waits." The ride to Clerkenwell was damp and shadowed, the gas lamps bleeding their feeble light into the mist as our hansom cab rattled over the cobblestones. Holmes, lost in thought, stared unblinking out the window. I'd grown accustomed to these long silences of his, periods where his mind raced far ahead of ours, chasing connections invisible to most. Occasionally, his lips moved without sound, as though rehearsing some inner hypothesis. "I assume," I said cautiously, "that you already doubt the diagnosis of apoplexy?" Holmes tilted his head slightly without turning. "I find it most useful, Watson, to doubt everything, until the facts compel belief. Apoplexy may be the final result, but I do not believe it the cause. A man does not simply die at the sound of music, unless his heart or mind was primed for such a finale." We arrived at Ludlow Crescent a few minutes later. It was a genteel street, the sort of place where time moved with the quiet dignity of curtain twitchers and afternoon tea. The townhouse at number 13 was a narrow, handsome brick structure with ivy creeping along its wrought-iron fence. A constable greeted us at the door, stepping aside to allow Lestrade to lead the way in. The interior was tastefully furnished, rich with polished wood and dark velvet. A heavy hush lay over the house, as though it too had drawn breath and waited. The parlour was situated at the rear of the ground floor. Holmes paused at the threshold, his eyes scanning every corner with the deliberate intensity of a predator. The room smelled faintly of rosewood polish and spent gaslight. The pianoforte stood near the far wall, an upright model, its scrollwork finely carved and the keys partially raised, frozen in mid-melody. A roll still sat inserted within the mechanism, its perforations like the score of a secret language. A half-empty sherry glass rested atop a small side table, alongside a crumpled linen handkerchief and a torn corner of newsprint. Holmes stepped silently across the room. "Sir Felix was found slumped here." "Yes," said Lestrade, motioning to a dark leather armchair positioned directly before the piano. "The maid, Molly Dawson, found him just past 10. The tune was still playing." Holmes crouched before the mechanical piano, examining its roll without yet touching it. "Watson, I believe you are somewhat familiar with these devices." I nodded. "Indeed. Mechanical pianos use paper rolls with perforated codes. When fed through the system, air pressure triggers the appropriate keys. It mimics live performance, though without interpretation or dynamic control." Holmes smiled faintly. "Very good. Which means anyone with sufficient knowledge or motive could easily program a specific tune. But to what end?" He turned back to Lestrade. "Was Sir Felix known to be in good health?" "Remarkably so. 71, sharp as a tack. Still walked every morning, wrote papers on judicial reform, and drank his nightly sherry without fail. No known heart trouble." Holmes reached down and, with gloved fingers, turned the roll forward slightly. The perforations formed a rhythmic pattern that he followed with his eyes. A deliberate selection, this. Not a common tune, and not without meaning. At that moment, a quiet cough came from the doorway. A woman stood there, perhaps in her late 50s, with tightly pinned grey hair and a no-nonsense air. "This is Mrs. Agatha Simmons," said Lestrade. "Housekeeper. Been with the family 20 years. "Mr. Holmes," she said stiffly, "I understand you're assisting the inspector. I'll answer your questions, but I want it known that Sir Felix was a good man. A just man." Holmes inclined his head politely. "I do not doubt it, madam. May I ask, was Sir Felix musically inclined?" "Not at all," she replied quickly. "Couldn't tell a symphony from a sailor's jig. The pianoforte belonged to Lady Simon, his late wife. She died 5 years ago. He kept it for sentiment, but it hadn't been played until last night." "Was the piano ever wound or maintained?" Holmes asked. "No, sir. In fact, it hadn't worked in years. The rolls were just gathering dust in a cabinet drawer. That's what was strange. None of us touched it. And yet, somehow, it played." Holmes walked to the cabinet in question, opening it with care. Inside lay a tidy collection of piano rolls, most untouched, save one that had clearly been moved recently, the edges smudged with prints. He extracted it gently, holding it up to the lamplight. "La sonnerie du soir," he murmured. "Do you recognize the tune, Mrs. Simmons?" She hesitated, then gave a slow nod. "I do. Lady Simon played it often. It was her favorite. She was French, you see." From Lyon, Holmes' eyes gleamed. "Interesting. Very interesting." He turned again to Lestrade. "Has the coroner examined the body in detail?" "Initial inspection only," the inspector replied. "We were waiting on you before giving permission for anything more invasive." Holmes nodded, satisfied. Good. Then let us visit the deceased before anything is disturbed. The body of Sir Felix had been respectfully laid out in the upper chamber, covered in a linen sheet. At Holmes's direction, the coroner, a young man named Dr. Hilbery, removed the cover and gave us access to the remains. Sir Felix's face bore no signs of agony, merely a wide-eyed vacancy, as though death had come in the middle of a thought. Holmes performed a brief examination. He sniffed lightly at the mouth, peered at the eyes, and examined the fingers under his lens. He muttered. No sign of cyanosis, no bruising or abrasion. However, Watson, would you say the man was in full rigor? I stepped forward. Not fully. Stiffness is present, but he's still somewhat pliable. Suggests a time of death between 8 and 10 o'clock last night, which matches the maid's account. Very good. Holmes examined the fingertips again. Note the faint powder, there beneath the nails, and the discoloration around the nostrils. Watson, could be residual from an irritant, I said slowly. Perhaps something inhaled. Indeed, said Holmes, which raises the possibility of a chemical agent, administered through proximity or perhaps through scent. He stood up briskly. I would like to speak to the maid now. Miss Dawson, was it? She was waiting downstairs, a nervous young woman with freckled skin and hair pulled into a tight bun. Holmes greeted her with gentleness. Miss Dawson, I understand you were the one who discovered the body? Yes, sir. I'd just finished setting the tea tray when I heard the piano. It was so sudden, like it came out of nowhere. I thought someone had broken in. Had anyone visited that day? She shook her head. No, sir. Just the usual post in the morning. Bills and such. No callers. Holmes's eyes narrowed. And the post? Is it handled by you? No, sir. Sir Felix always insisted on reading it himself. Said it kept his mind sharp. Holmes turned to me as she left. And now, Watson, the shape begins to emerge. How so? He gestured vaguely. A man dies at the sound of a song, his wife's favorite. The piano, long dormant, suddenly plays of its own accord. And we find evidence not of violence, but of exposure. Exposure, I suggest, to something more delicate than steel or poison, an aroma, a trace, perhaps, a memory. He walked to the drawing-room window and gazed into the night. Watson, he said softly, we are not hunting a killer alone. We are tracing a ghost with a composer's hand and a score written in silence. I felt the shiver return. Holmes remained by the glass, the fog pressing its face against the panes like a watcher in the dark. We were at the threshold of a mystery that defied the ordinary, and Holmes, already, had heard its first haunting note. Holmes remained at the window long after Lestrade had gone to confer with the coroner, and the house had settled once more into uneasy silence. The fog outside thickened, clinging to the panes like a shroud. I stood by the pianoforte, my gaze lingering on the roll still nestled. Within the machine, La Sonnerie du Soir. That a song might kill a man seemed fantastical, yet in Holmes's world, the improbable often gave way to cold, explainable fact. He turned abruptly. Come, Watson, we are not finished here, not by any means. I followed him out of the parlor and into the hallway. He beckoned Mrs. Simmons, who approached with her usual briskness. Madam, would you kindly inform me of Sir Felix's routine in the days leading up to his death? Anything unusual, any break in pattern, however small? She pursed her lips, clearly sifting through her memory. Nothing that I can recall. He was, as always, punctual and solitary. Took his walk every morning, never missed it, rain or shine. Returned around 10, had his breakfast in the study, read the papers, perhaps wrote a letter or two. Afternoons he'd sit by the window with his sherry. Since Lady Simon passed, he'd grown rather fixed, Mr. Holmes, as though life was something to observe, not partake in. Did he receive visitors often? Rarely. There was one man last week, a foreign gentleman. I did not catch his name. French, I believe. He wore gloves, even indoors. Polite, soft-spoken. They spoke in the study for nearly half an hour. Holmes's expression sharpened. Describe him. Taller than average, graying at the temples, clean-shaven, dressed in a dark overcoat, had a thin mustache. He left without fanfare, and Sir Felix said nothing of him after. Holmes nodded slowly. This man, did he touch anything? Leave anything behind? She blinked. Not that I noticed, though the morning after his visit I did find one of the old music rolls lying on the parlor sideboard. Odd as they hadn't been touched in years. Holmes smiled faintly. Not odd at all, Mrs. Simmons. Merely overlooked, until it sang its final note. She looked puzzled, but Holmes had already turned away. Watson, I believe the key to this mystery lies not in the room where the death occurred, but in the one where the past was invited to sit for tea. We proceeded to Sir Felix's study, a smaller, book-lined room overlooking the garden. The scent of tobacco lingered faintly in the air, mingling with that of paper and ink. Holmes moved like a shadow, fingers brushing over surfaces, eyes alert for the smallest aberration. He paused at the writing desk, where a blotter held a half-finished letter. It's dated 2 days prior to the death, Holmes noted. He read aloud. To whom it may concern, I do not regret my judgment, though others have. The past is not a debt that must always be repaid. Some things once buried should remain so. F.S. Holmes tapped the paper with a finger. Rather cryptic. Would you agree, Watson? Certainly. It implies a fear or expectation of retribution. Indeed. And notice the shift in tone, not legal but personal. I believe Sir Felix knew that something, or someone, from his past had returned. Holmes examined the desk drawers, opening each in turn until he came upon a slim packet of correspondence bound with red string. Inside were several letters, their dates ranging from the late 1870s to the early 1890s, written in slanting French script. He read one silently, then handed it to me. Translation, if you please. I scanned the page. It appears to be from a woman named Clémence. She writes with affection and melancholy. She speaks of Paris, of a son, but she pleads for news, for contact. It seems Sir Felix had a relationship abroad. Not merely a relationship, Holmes said, tapping another page, but an abandonment. He left behind more than memory. Listen to this. Tu m'as promis que notre fils serait reconnu. Mais tu es retourné à ta vie anglaise. Il croit que tu es mort. Je t'en supplie, dis-lui la vérité. He promised to acknowledge their child, I murmured, but never did. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Precisely. Sir Felix Simon, stalwart magistrate, had a child born of a liaison in France, unacknowledged, unknown, and abandoned. If that child, or mother, sought vengeance, what better method than a song known only to the late Lady Simon? A tune intimately linked with the household, but long dormant. Revived, it would startle, unnerve, perhaps even kill if accompanied by something more sinister. Like a vaporized agent, I asked. Exactly. Something administered quietly, perhaps rubbed on the piano keys or released into the air when the role played. It would require careful planning. Someone familiar with the house, with Sir Felix's habits, and with that specific song. Holmes pocketed the letters. We must identify this mysterious visitor, the Frenchman with gloves. We returned to Lestrade, who had just concluded with the coroner. Holmes explained his hypothesis in concise terms. Lestrade listened with the practiced expression of one frequently stunned but unwilling to show it. I'll have the staff at the Dover ports questioned, Lestrade said. If he arrived from Calais, someone might remember. Also, check the guest registers at local inns. He may have stayed nearby, Holmes added. And send this list. He handed Lestrade a scribbled sheet. To the chemists in Clerkenwell. Ask if anyone inquired recently about inhalants derived from belladonna or similar compounds. As Lestrade departed, Holmes turned to me with that sudden alacrity I had come to expect. Come, Watson. There is one person left who may shed light on this affair, if she still resides where I last heard she did. Who? Lady Clemence Simon never remarried. If her letters continued these many years, it suggests she lived in hope. And hope, Watson, when betrayed, curdles into something very like hatred. We took a cab south of the river, winding through quieter streets until we reached a modest boarding house tucked behind a row of shuttered shops. A faded sign read, Maison Verdure. Holmes knocked twice. A woman answered, middle-aged with weary eyes, and a face still bearing the traces of former beauty. Madame Clemence Simon, Holmes asked gently. She hesitated. I am she. I am Sherlock Holmes. I come regarding Sir Felix Simon at the name. Her eyes closed, and she leaned against the door frame as though a long-expected guest had finally arrived. I will speak, she said, but not out here. We were led into a quiet sitting room. No photographs hung on the walls, but upon a small piano rested a frame holding a hand-copied score. La Sonnerie du Soir. My skin prickled. Holmes remained still. Madame, I believe you loved him once, but I also believe you are not alone in that suffering. You had a son? Yes, she said, her voice a whisper. Jean-Paul. He's 28 now. He came to England last week. I begged him not to go. Holmes's gaze sharpened. You think he intended violence? I don't know, she said, only that he was angry. He said that father had made a decision long ago and lived without consequence, that he would make him feel the silence, that he would use the only thing he remembered, my music. Holmes stood abruptly. Thank you, madam. You have helped more than you know. Watson, we must return at once. As we hurried into the night, Holmes spoke low but with urgency. A son, raised on silence, now conducting his own symphony of justice. But he's not finished. Not yet. He played one song, but I fear the encore is already prepared. The fog swallowed our cab as it surged toward Baker Street, and whatever revelation the next movement of this dark composition would bring. The clatter of hooves and the creak of the cab wheels echoed through the fog as we sped back toward Baker Street. Holmes sat forward, fingers steepled beneath his chin, his eyes alight with that particular intensity that signaled the convergence of disparate threads into a coherent design. I had learned long ago that this phase of his mental process was the most dangerous for any criminal within reach. Watson, he said without turning his head, we are no longer searching for a motive. We are searching for the final act. Jean-Paul Simon has struck once, and I fear he has no intention of stopping at a single gesture of poetic vengeance. Do you believe he intends to kill again? Not believes, knows. The act was too theatrical, too deliberate to be the catharsis of a lone crime. Sir Felix was the overture. What follows will be the crescendo. I gripped the edge of the seat as the cab swung hard around a corner. But who could be next? He came for his father. What remains? Holmes's eyes flicked to me. What remains, Watson, is not the man, but the name. Jean-Paul may have come for the blood that abandoned him, but now he sees a society that shielded that man, a country that allowed a hidden life to flourish without consequence. I would wager he's prepared a second performance, and the audience will be larger. When we arrived at Baker Street, Holmes wasted no time. He dashed inside and made straight for the desk in the sitting room, rifling through a pile of envelopes and telegrams. After a moment, he held up a half-folded note. This arrived the day before yesterday, a message from the Royal Society of Magistrates, an invitation to a memorial lecture on judicial ethics to be delivered tomorrow evening at Guildhall. The speaker was to have been Sir Felix himself. His absence will now be a matter of public note. Then it will be cancelled, surely, I said. Holmes shook his head. The letter states that Sir Felix was to open the event, but the keynote is to be delivered by Sir Reginald Varner, his old colleague and friend. You remember Varner? Staunch traditionalist, vehement defender of moral rigidity on the bench. If Jean-Paul learned of this event, and he certainly could have through his father's correspondence, he might see it as the perfect venue for a dramatic second statement. Lestrade arrived moments later, hat in hand and looking grim. "We've got confirmation," he said without preamble. A Frenchman answering the description of Jean-Paul Simon stayed 3 nights at a boarding house off Mare Street in Hackney. Paid in cash, left yesterday morning. Spoke fluent English with a slight accent. The landlady said he asked for directions to Clerkenwell, and also to Guildhall. Holmes glanced at me. The stage is already set. "But what do you suspect he'll do?" I asked. Surely he cannot intend to repeat the method. A second death via piano roll would stretch credulity. Holmes gave a rare nod of approval. "Just so, Watson. He is unlikely to repeat the trick. He is clever, and a son of 2 nations. This next act must be louder, more public, and more symbolic. Jean-Paul is not merely avenging a personal grievance. He is composing a denunciation. The question is, how?" Holmes moved to the bookshelf and removed a volume on obscure poisons and chemical dispersals. We must assume he has some knowledge of pharmacology. Something administered through air, through scent, through sound, perhaps even sensation. If his next target is Sir Reginald, then we must get to him before Jean-Paul does. Lestrade looked grim. "We'll place a guard at Guildhall at once. I'll wire the yard." "No," said Holmes, lifting a hand. "Not a guard, a shadow. Jean-Paul must believe he is unobserved. If he suspects interference, he may alter his course. Or worse, accelerate it." Lestrade hesitated, then gave a curt nod and left to organize a quiet watch on the venue. Holmes turned to me, his expression unreadable. "We must locate Jean-Paul before he executes the second movement of his dark composition." We returned once more to Clerkenwell, not to the house of Sir Felix, but to its surroundings. Holmes paced the narrow pavements, eyes scanning the buildings opposite number 13. "There," he said, pointing to a modest bookshop across the street. "A clear view of the front door. If I were preparing a murder, Watson, I would not only require access, I would require certainty. Jean-Paul would have wanted to observe the timing of the household, the habits of the staff. I suspect he spent time here." The shop was dimly lit, with the faint smell of old paper and varnish. A balding man behind the counter looked up with faint suspicion as we entered. "I am Sherlock Holmes," said Holmes smoothly, producing a card. "I seek information, not trouble. You had a visitor last week, a Frenchman, well-dressed, tall, dark-haired with grey at the temples. Purchased or browsed through your musical literature, perhaps?" The man's eyes narrowed. "I don't give names, sir. But, yes, I remember the gentleman. Came in 2 or 3 times. Always browsed in the back near the antiquities. Seemed more interested in observing the street than in buying anything." "Did he ask any questions?" "Only about piano rolls. Wanted to know if we had any by Monsieur Faure, though I told him we didn't deal in such specifics." Holmes nodded. "Thank you. You've been most helpful." Outside, the fog was lifting slightly, revealing a sliver of moonlight. "That confirms it," Holmes said. "Jean-Paul scouted the scene days in advance, but he is no longer here. He's moving, always moving. If he sees the law catching up, he may vanish. We need a lever." He paused, his gaze distant. "And perhaps we already have one." I followed his eyes, confused. "What do you mean?" "His mother," Holmes said simply. "He loves her. She is the only connection he preserved. He did not lie to her. She may not approve of his actions, but he did not deceive her. If he fears she may be endangered or disillusioned, he may hesitate." "You intend to speak with her again?" "No," Holmes said. "I intend to write to her. Watson, I must compose a message in the most human of languages, not deduction, but compassion. If I can appeal to the mother, she may draw back the son. That night, Holmes sat long at his desk, pen scratching across fine stationery with uncharacteristic softness. I did not read the note, nor did he offer it. It was not addressed to me. By morning, the letter had been delivered by private courier to Maison Verdre. Holmes waited without speaking, eyes fixed on the clock above the mantel. At 11:15, there was a knock. Lestrade entered, holding a crumpled note. A constable on watch at Guildhall just received this. It was pushed under the West Service door. No one saw who left it. He handed it to Holmes, who read it aloud. "No encore. I've heard the silence clearly now. Let the curtain fall." J.P. Holmes exhaled slowly. "It is over. He has withdrawn. Whether by his mother's hand or by his own conscience, he will not strike again." Lestrade looked dubious. "You're sure?" Holmes nodded. Jean-Paul Simon was not a killer by nature. He was a composer of judgment. He wanted his father to feel, perhaps for the first time, the echo of a past he had silenced. With that one act, the composition was complete. Any repetition would cheapen the performance. He stood, turning to the window once more. The law could chase him, Watson, but in truth it would gain little. Justice of a kind was done, not perfect, perhaps, but resonant. Outside, the fog was breaking, the city reassembling its familiar face beneath the morning light. Holmes watched it a moment longer, then said, more to himself than to me, "A man died to the sound of a song." But it was the silence after that told the tale. Holmes remained by the window long after Lestrade had taken his leave. The note, succinct, restrained, and final, lay upon the mantel like a piece of music whose final chord still resonated through the silence of our sitting room. Outside, the fog thinned into a hazy silver wash over Baker Street, but I could see in Holmes's stillness that something within him remained unsatisfied. "You believe him," I said finally, "that he will not strike again?" Holmes turned slightly, the pale light catching the edge of his cheekbone. "I believe the mind of Jean-Paul Simon is not governed by cruelty, Watson. He does not take pleasure in death. He takes meaning, and I believe he now sees that his performance, if carried beyond its natural conclusion, would become noise instead of message." He returned to his chair, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. "And yet," the word hung in the air. "You doubt his withdrawal?" I prompted. "Not doubt," he murmured. "But I have learned never to trust the neatness of endings, especially those that arrive by written confession. He played a complex melody, Watson, one of planning, emotion, symbolism. He would not end it so abruptly. I ask myself, did we hear the true finale, or merely the diminuendo?" I frowned. "You believe the letter may have been a deception?" "I entertain the possibility. Consider this. He vanished. No body, no arrest, not even a name. He exists to us in memory and inference. His only tangible act a death wrapped in theatre. What better way to slip beyond reach than to declare oneself finished?" Holmes stood again and crossed to his desk, opening a drawer to retrieve the piano roll he had taken from Sir Felix's cabinet. He placed it gently on the table, as though it was some rare manuscript. "This roll," he said, "was not merely a delivery system. It was a message. The choice of La Sonnerie du Soir was no accident. It is the call that ends the military day in France, the last sound a soldier hears before sleep or death. It was a farewell, and yet too deliberate, too polished. Jean-Paul did not merely wish to kill. He wished to leave something behind." I joined him, examining the roll with growing unease. "You suspect there is more encoded here?" "Possibly. Perhaps not in the paper, but in the act. It is a symbol, Watson, one whose echo may yet linger." He paused, then glanced sharply at the door. "Do you hear that?" I strained my ears, hearing only the usual sounds of Baker Street, a passing cart, a barked greeting from the greengrocer's boy. Holmes moved swiftly to the window. "No, not from outside. Then I heard it too. Faint, barely audible. Music. A note. Two. A phrase. Then silence. The sound had come from within the house. Holmes was already in motion. He threw open the sitting-room door and strode to the hallway. I followed, heart pounding. We descended the stairs and turned toward the rear. The door to our seldom-used parlor stood ajar. Holmes pushed it wide. There, on the old pianoforte, long unused and kept only for rare social calls, lay another piano roll, identical in shape and size to the one from Clerkenwell. The keys were still. "Mrs. Hudson," Holmes called, voice sharp. She appeared almost instantly from the kitchen, drying her hands on a towel, eyes wide with alarm. "Did anyone come through here? Anyone unfamiliar, "No, Mr. Holmes, not a soul." Holmes strode to the instrument and inspected it. The roll was new, unmarked, save for a single penciled phrase at the edge. "Variation in D, for the observer." He stood frozen for a moment, then exhaled. "So, it is not over. He has responded." "To you," I said, stunned. "He left this for you." "Indeed." He turned to me, his face unreadable. "We have left the realm of crime, Watson. We now move through the corridors of challenge. Jean-Paul Simon has declared that I have entered his composition, and now I must play my part." "Is it dangerous?" I asked. Holmes tapped the edge of the roll. "Not physically. Not yet. This is a message. He knows I see the pattern. He knows I suspect the truth behind his withdrawal. This is a warning and a riddle, and it changes everything." He carried the roll upstairs to his desk, laying it beside the first. I watched as he placed both side by side, eyes moving between them as though scanning sheet music only he could interpret. "Watson, I must ask you something unusual." "Go on." "I need you to visit the Royal Society of Magistrates. Make polite inquiry. See if anyone has received recent anonymous correspondence, especially anything poetic, musical, or written in a tone of artistic reflection. Mention nothing of Simon unless absolutely necessary. We are no longer pursuing a criminal. We are engaging AI, composer, and a composer will not act again until his next movement is complete." I departed at once, my mind turning over the strange message and its eerie delivery. At the Society's office, I was met with courtesy and confusion. No, they said, they had received no such letters, nothing strange, nothing anonymous. That was until one junior clerk, Mr. Langdon, remembered something. A pamphlet. "It came in with the Morning Post," he said. "No return address, no cover note. Just a slim printed booklet, odd little thing. A reflection on justice through musical metaphor." He fetched it from a desk drawer. I read the title aloud. "In 3 movements, a study in disharmony." Inside were 3 essays. The first, Overture, concerned the moral arrogance of legal systems. The second, Elegy, dwelled on the death of ideals beneath the burden of appearances. The third, Coda, was brief, barely a paragraph. It ended with the line, "A final note remains, unheard. It awaits the discerning ear." I returned to Baker Street at once. Holmes read the pamphlet with quiet intensity, turning each page as though decoding a cipher. When he reached the final line, he did not speak for nearly a minute. Then, "It is a map. To where? To the final performance. He is building toward it. One more act, perhaps the grandest. It will be his testament, his protest, his truth, and it will be wrapped in metaphor so thick that only the intended listener, me, can interpret it." He stood suddenly. "Watson, we must go back to the place it began. Not Sir Felix's house, and not the shop, not the Guildhall." He looked at me. "We must go to the theatre." I blinked. The theatre. Of course. Where else does one stage a finale? And without another word, Holmes turned to fetch his coat, his eyes gleaming with the cold fire of certainty, as though he could already hear the curtain rising. Within the hour, We were once more enveloped by the shifting fog and cold pulse of the London streets, though this time Holmes's pace was charged with singular direction. His long strides cut through the mist as we wound our way toward the Strand, where the flickering gas lights outside theatres and music halls gave the fog a ghostly shimmer. I followed close behind, suppressing my questions, for I had learned that when Holmes moved with this kind of intent, his mind was performing a symphony of deduction that should not be interrupted until the final note. He did not stop until we reached a discreet corner off Bow Street, where the weathered signage of the Thespian Society's private hall hung askew over an iron-gated entrance. It was not a venue well known to the public, but to Holmes, who had long cultivated friendships across every profession from costumers to conductors, its significance was immediately clear. "Watson," he said, pausing before the entrance, "this hall once hosted private performances for the judiciary and intellectual societies of London. Sir Felix Simon was a member here in his youth, an amateur patron of theatre, though never a performer himself. The hall has lain largely dormant since the turn of the century, but Jean-Paul would not have chosen it for its popularity. He would have chosen it for its irony. A place of performance, of illusion, a final act played for no audience but one. We found the main door unlocked, the interior dark but not abandoned. Holmes lit a lamp from a nearby wall sconce, and the golden glow spread out across rows of dust-veiled seats and a narrow raised stage that bore the scars of forgotten performances. The silence within was almost reverent. We advanced down the central aisle, the sound of our footsteps swallowed by thick velvet and dust. On the stage stood a single object, a piano forte, a third piano. This one bore no cover, no sheet music, and no roll. It was bare, as though awaiting hands to give it voice. Holmes ascended the few steps to the platform, his face drawn tight with concentration. I remained in the aisle, watching as he examined the instrument, then stooped to inspect the pedals and frame. He did not touch the keys. Then he straightened. "Watson, you must see this." I joined him on the stage. He pointed toward the floorboards behind the piano's legs. Scored into the wood, in careful, deliberate letters, was a message, barely perceptible in the dim light. "To the conductor who hears in silence." Below that, a row of numbers arranged not as a date, but as a sequence. Holmes murmured as he read, 4-12-6-1-9-. Patois. "It looks like a cipher," I said, frowning. "More than a cipher," Holmes replied. "A measure of rhythm. This is not a code in the traditional sense. It's a phrase of musical timing. Time signatures, perhaps, or sequence markers. But more importantly, he has placed it here, in a venue unused for years, which means he returned." He walked across the stage, slowly, thoughtfully. "3 instruments, Watson. 1 in the home of the man he killed, 1 delivered as a message, and now this, naked, waiting. It is a triad. But why?" I opened my mouth to offer a theory, but then Holmes stopped abruptly, his hand raised. A sound echoed faintly through the hall. From somewhere beyond the stage, behind the curtain, came the soft click of a mechanism. Not music, but something being wound. Holmes moved instantly, crossing to the heavy drapes at stage left. He parted them and passed through without hesitation. I followed, heart thudding in my ears. Behind the stage was a narrow corridor that curved toward the wings. The click came again, more deliberate now, as though issuing a challenge. We rounded a corner, passed through a low archway, and entered a small green room filled with forgotten props, a warped mirror, and a cracked armchair. And there, upon the vanity table, was a metronome. Ticking. Holmes approached it slowly, eyes sharp, breath controlled. The device was modern, new. It swung steadily, back and forth, its tempo unnervingly human. Tucked beneath its wooden base was a folded slip of paper. Holmes picked it up and read aloud. When justice cannot speak, time becomes the instrument of judgment. The final act begins at midnight. The song will not be played. It will be lived. He lowered the paper, face composed but alert. He is not done. He is staging something real, something physical. He wants his message to extend beyond the dead. This is no longer an allegory, Watson. This is prophecy. What does he mean by lived? And who is his intended audience now? Holmes stepped back, gaze distant. Midnight. That gives us less than 6 hours. Whatever he plans will not be confined to the theatre. This is merely the overture. We returned to Baker Street with urgency. Holmes reviewed the notes from the pamphlet once more, tracing the phrases like a composer seeking the heart of a melody. Then, with sudden conviction, he spoke. Watson, do you recall the second essay? Elegy. He speaks of death not as an end, but a motif that recurs beneath the surface of systems. I missed it before. He mentioned names, titles, obliquely as symbols. The bench where silence rules, the ledger that absolves the guilty, the chamber that applauds itself. I nodded slowly. You believe these are references? Yes, and one phrase repeats subtly in each, Whitehall Court. It appears in metaphor, disguised. But I now believe he is referring not to the Court of Governance in abstraction, but the actual building, the Ministry of Justice itself. A government target? I said, the weight of the suggestion sinking in. Not for bloodshed, Holmes replied. He is not a man of bombs, but a statement, a demonstration. I believe Jean-Paul Simon plans to use the very heart of British legal authority as his final stage. Holmes stood and seized his coat once more. We must warn the yard. Lestrade must post a quiet cordon around Whitehall Court. No panic, no publicity. And we, Watson, must go there ourselves. If I know Jean-Paul, he has already begun preparing the performance, and we may yet prevent him from writing his last line. The fog had thickened again by the time we emerged, as though London itself conspired to blur the line between what was real and what was staged. And through that mist, beneath the gas lamps and the hush of evening descent, Holmes's silhouette moved ahead of me. Lean and relentless, the only conductor who might yet rewrite the final bar of a song that had already begun to play. We arrived at Whitehall Court shortly past 7 o'clock, the night grown darker than it had any right to be, and the fog dense as wool. Even in the obscurity, the looming facade of the Ministry of Justice was unmistakable. Its stern, angular silhouette rising above the Thames like some ancient watchtower. Gas lamps flickered in long symmetrical rows, their reflections barely visible in the oily black of the river. Lestrade met us by the eastern side entrance, his brow furrowed and his moustache glistening with moisture. We've got 4 plainclothes inside, Mr. Holmes, and another pair watching each entrance. Not a soul's gone in or out without being noted. Holmes offered no greeting. His attention was already on the building itself. Any unusual activity this evening? Nothing thus far. The cleaning staff were dismissed early by order of the permanent secretary. Apparently some electrical maintenance is scheduled, but no engineers have shown up. Holmes's eyes narrowed. No engineers? Not a one, Lestrade confirmed. Why? Because I very much doubt there was ever any such maintenance scheduled. Tell your men to search for anyone in uniform. Electricians, postal clerks, messengers. Anyone who might have blended in without question. As Lestrade moved to relay the instruction, Holmes turned to me. Jean-Paul Simon is inside. I would stake my life on it. But he will not strike with poison, nor song, nor spectacle. Not this time. I looked up at the shadowy windows. Then how? He will use the building itself, its structure, its purpose. He intends to expose the rot beneath the marble. But he won't do it with violence, not directly. I believe, Watson, that he has prepared something demonstrative. Demonstrative? Holmes gave a small nod, lips tight. He is not an assassin. He is a composer, and this is not his final act. It is his most elaborate fuse. We slipped inside via the east entrance, our steps muffled by the thick carpeting of the main corridor. The ministry's inner sanctum was a cold, echoing expanse of black marble and brass fixtures. Empty chairs lined the walls like mute witnesses. At the heart of the building rose the central atrium, a vast, domed chamber whose acoustics had earned it the nickname the Chamber of Whispers. Holmes's pace slowed as we entered this space, his head tilting slightly, ears attuned. "You hear that?" he asked softly. I listened. Nothing but the faint hum of gas lamps and the creak of distant wood. "No," I whispered. "Exactly. No echo. This space should sing at the faintest footstep. It doesn't. Something is absorbing the sound." Holmes stepped into the center of the floor, turning slowly in place. His eyes scanned the railings of the upper gallery, the carved archways, the long drapes that hung in unnatural stillness. Then, abruptly, he dropped to one knee. He drew a penknife from his coat and made a shallow incision into the edge of the carpet at his feet. Beneath it, cotton batting, layered thick. Holmes looked up at me. "He has muffled the room." "But why? For whom?" "For the audience," he said grimly. "He wants silence, Watson. Not absence of sound, but the deliberate exclusion of it. This entire building is symbolic, the seat of justice. The chamber at its center represents law, judgment, voice. Jean-Paul has turned it into a tomb." We were interrupted by a sharp whistle from the far archway. A constable hurried over, breathless. "Inspector Lestrade says he's found something. Sub-basement. Wants you both there at once." Holmes was already moving, and I followed him through the winding lower halls until we reached a set of stone steps leading down. At the bottom, in the musty, seldom-used archives, Lestrade waited by an open door. "In here," he said tersely. "Found it while sweeping for concealed entries." We stepped into a room barely 10 feet across. Stacks of old ledgers and water-stained documents filled the corners, but what commanded immediate attention was the object in the center. A mechanical device. Not explosive. Holmes verified that instantly. But intricate. At its base, an array of brass pipes and levers fed into a cylindrical core lined with scroll paper. At the top, a wide speaker cone, the kind once used to amplify music in phonograph exhibitions. It was not a bomb. It was an instrument. "A programmable sound projector," Holmes breathed. "Modified. He intends to use it in the atrium." Lestrade looked dumbfounded. "But why?" Holmes stepped back. "Because this is not a weapon. It is a confession, and I believe it is programmed to deliver it at midnight." I stared at the strange machine. "A confession?" "Not his," Holmes said softly. "His father's." We returned to the atrium, Holmes carrying the scroll paper we had removed from the device. He spread it across a table and began to examine the perforations, cross-referencing them with the musical cipher we had found at the theater. "This isn't music," he muttered. "These are syllables, phonetic cues. A voice, Watson. Not a tune. He has recorded a speech." It took Holmes no more than 10 minutes to decode the first few lines. "My name is Felix Simon. I was once a man of law. But I buried a truth for the sake of reputation. I judged men for sins I'd committed in silence. I had a son, born in secrecy, raised in shame." He stopped. "It goes on like this. A confession, carefully crafted. Crafted, I believe, not by the father, but the son. I would wager the voice has been reconstructed from old recordings. A composite performance." Lestrade looked troubled. "If he sets this off in the atrium, it will echo through every floor," Holmes finished. "Through the chambers of the ministry, through the very heart of justice, and once heard, it cannot be unheard." Holmes rolled the scroll tightly. "We must find him. He will be nearby, watching. He would not leave such a performance unattended." We split up. Lestrade took the upper galleries, I the adjoining offices. Holmes returned to the archive corridor. For nearly half an hour we searched, calling softly, alert for any movement. Then, from the roof, 3 sharp knocks. Not an alarm, a signal. I raced upstairs with Lestrade just behind me. At the top, past the iron hatch that led to the maintenance balcony above the dome, we found Holmes kneeling beside a figure slumped against the parapet wall. Jean-Paul Simon, alive, unconscious. Next to him, a bottle, labeled laudanum, half empty. Holmes was already pressing his fingers to the man's pulse. Alive, he said, but fading. We carried him down with care and summoned a physician who declared he would recover with rest and care. He intended to disappear, Holmes said as we watched over him. His voice was never meant to be heard again, only his father's. Lestrade turned to Holmes. And what do we do with the scroll? Holmes looked to me, then back at Lestrade. That, Inspector, is not for me to decide. It contains no crime, only truth. And the question of whether truth belongs to history or the present is a matter far beyond my jurisdiction. He looked down at Jean-Paul, sleeping now, the strain and anger gone from his brow. Sometimes, Watson, Holmes said quietly, a son must write the words a father never spoke. And in the silent atrium of Whitehall Court, for the first time that evening, I felt the music stop. The following morning arrived with that peculiar clarity only found after nights thick with fog and incident. The light was crisp but pale as it filtered through the windows of our Baker Street lodgings. Holmes sat in his armchair, legs crossed. The previous night's events settled heavily around him like a mantle. The roll of confession, still wound and unread by the public, rested in a sealed envelope on the table between us. He had refused to destroy it, nor had he advocated for its release. Instead, he had placed it in the care of Inspector Lestrade, with the quiet understanding that it must be handled as one might a loaded pistol, delicately and never casually. I had half expected Holmes to dive back into some arcane monograph or lose himself in a chemical experiment, but he did neither. He remained still, his gaze unfocused, his fingers occasionally twitching as if conducting a silent piece of music only he could hear. "He's awake," I said, folding the newspaper I had just finished. "Jean-Paul Simon. Lestrade wired a message an hour ago. He's recovering steadily." Holmes inclined his head slightly, but did not speak. "Do you intend to visit him?" "I do," he replied after a long pause. "But not yet." I leaned forward, curious. "Why?" "Because the man who awoke this morning is not the same man who constructed that final movement. Last night, he was a composer on the brink of vanishing into his own elegy. Today, he must confront the aftermath. And in that confrontation, Watson, I fear something altogether more human awaits." I frowned. "You think he regrets it?" Holmes gave a dry, humorless smile. "Number, but I think he's no longer certain whether he succeeded. To his mind, his father's sins have now been spoken aloud, through voice, through silence, through structure. But no confession is complete without reception, and yet no one has heard the recording but us." "And Lestrade," I added. "Yes, but Lestrade sees evidence, not meaning. Jean-Paul will wait, perhaps even ask, to know whether the truth he fashioned has lived beyond the machine." Holmes stood then, slowly, stretching as if rousing from some long inner journey. "We must go, Watson. The time has come. There are loose threads still to tie." We travelled not to Scotland Yard, as I had assumed, but to Maison Verdure once again. Holmes insisted on returning there before meeting Jean-Paul. I asked no questions. The air was light now, the fog burned away by the clear chill of the morning, and the narrow street where Clémence Simon lived looked more ordinary than I remembered it, less like the birthplace of a tragedy and more like a place where someone might still hope for peace. Madame Simon greeted us at the door, weariness drawn deep into the folds of her face, but her voice was calm, even composed. "I expected you," she said, leading us inside. You found him? We did, Holmes said. He's alive and under care. She nodded. He never wished to live in violence. That much I knew, but he was born into a silence so heavy it pressed him into action. Holmes studied her closely. He kept your music, madam. That tune, La Sonnerie du Soir, was not merely a symbol of your grief. It was the only piece of you he was permitted to keep. When he made it the anthem of his vengeance, it was not for melodrama. It was for memory. Clémence's gaze drifted to the shelf above the fireplace, where the hand-copied score still rested in its modest frame. You understand him more than I feared, and perhaps more than he expected. He staged an extraordinary confession, Holmes said gently. One that will likely never be publicly heard. She closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, they were misted but dry. Good. Let it stay that way. The man he targeted is gone. The man he needed to hear it, heard. And I have no wish to see him judged again by a system that never once judged the man who left us both. Holmes inclined his head slightly, an unspoken agreement passing between them. No charges had been filed, and Lestrade, despite his consternation, had found himself caught in a legal and moral impasse. There had been no deaths beyond Sir Felix's. No theft, no sabotage, only sound. Message. It was late afternoon when we finally arrived at the infirmary where Jean-Paul Simon had been, placed under light guard. A clean but sparse room, whitewashed and cold. He sat upright in the bed, his arms folded across his chest, looking not at us as we entered, but out the window where the skyline of London sketched itself against a darkening sky. Good evening, Holmes said. I see you've returned to yourself. Jean-Paul didn't turn his head. Did it play? No, Holmes said. We found it, disarmed it. The message remains sealed. He looked at Holmes then, his expression unreadable. And what will you do with it? Holmes took a seat beside the bed. That depends. What did you intend for it to do? Jean-Paul didn't answer immediately. He looked down at his hands, then slowly back toward the window. My father judged men for secrets lesser than the one he kept. He never acknowledged me, not to his colleagues, not even in death, but he left behind papers, letters, enough for me to reconstruct the man he once was. I wanted the world to hear the truth, but in the end, I didn't know if anyone would listen. They might have, Holmes said softly. Or they might have dismissed it as a forgery, or worse, ignored it altogether. But that was not your father's voice, was it? Not entirely. No, Jean-Paul admitted. Some of the words were mine, shaped from his tone, his syntax, his public statements, the kind of speech he would have made if he had ever possessed the courage. Holmes nodded slowly. Then you succeeded, I think. You gave him the voice he denied both you and your mother. There was a long silence between them, and then Holmes added, And now? Jean-Paul met his eyes directly. Now I rest. Then I disappear. You won't be pursued, Holmes said, but I would advise against any further encores. Jean-Paul gave the faintest of smiles. Even the best composers must know when to stop. When we left the infirmary, Holmes said nothing for several minutes. It was not until we reached Baker Street again, with the gas lights flickering low and the evening pressing in, that he finally spoke. There is a kind of justice, Watson, he said quietly, that does not reside in law. One that exists in memory, in message. Jean-Paul Simon did not kill his father. He startled him into death, yes, but the man died of a life unfinished, not a hand unseen. You're saying we did the right thing, I said. I'm saying, Holmes corrected, that in a world where every crime has motive and every motive a history, sometimes solving a case means not merely revealing the truth, but deciding what form of it will serve. We stood in silence then, and somewhere far off, the echo of a piano, a real one, not mechanical, drifted through the London streets. A gentle melody, faint, perhaps a rehearsal or a memory. But for both of us, it sounded like a coda. The next few days passed with deceptive calm. London returned to its regular rhythms, cabs jostling along the cobbled roads, newsboys crying the headlines with scarcely veiled desperation, and clerks, barristers, and tradesmen retreating once more into the grey hum of their obligations. The death of Sir Felix Simon had made only a modest column in the Times, framed as a sudden heart failure, the kind that so often claimed the elderly with neither warning nor scandal. There was no mention of piano rolls, confessions, or sons born in silence. Yet beneath that surface, a different current pulsed. Holmes remained at Baker Street, but his stillness was not idleness. He sat in the high-backed chair by the fire, surrounded by sheaves of paper, some from the Ministry of Justice, others in his own hand. I knew better than to ask their contents too soon. When he was ready to speak, he would, and not a moment before. It was not until the fourth morning, as the light broke across the rooftops and bathed the sitting room in the color of old brass, that he turned his eyes toward me. "You recall the final line of Jean-Paul's pamphlet?" he asked. I thought a moment. "The final note remains, unheard. It awaits the discerning ear." "Precisely. A phrase laden with ambiguity. Deliberately so. I thought at first it referred to the scroll or to the staged confession in the ministry. But the more I considered it, the more I wondered. What if there was another note, a true final message, withheld even from the grand production we witnessed? I looked up from my tea. "You think he left behind something else?" "I know he did. The man's methods were meticulous, symbolic. His entire campaign was composed like a suite. One movement, then the next, always with thematic continuity. There is a rhythm to his actions, Watson, a mathematical precision that suggests he would not leave his score incomplete." "Then what are we missing?" Holmes stood and crossed to the sideboard where he had carefully laid out the 3 piano rolls we had encountered. The first from Sir Felix's home, the second delivered mysteriously to Baker Street, and the third, never used, discovered in the ministry's green room. He aligned them on the table with care. "Observe," he said, pointing. "Each roll is marked with a title in the same hand. The first, La Sonnerie du Soir. The second, Variation in D, for the observer. The third, nothing at all, blank." I stared at them, brow furrowing. It wasn't titled, but it was clearly the most elaborate of the 3. "Indeed. And what would you make of a composer who names his overture and interlude but leaves the finale unnamed?" "That it was not meant to stand alone?" I ventured. Holmes gave a tight smile. "Or that it awaited recognition by the right ear. Consider, if Jean-Paul intended his final message to be forgotten, he would not have constructed it at all. No, he wanted it heard, but only by one who had followed the entire sequence." He opened a drawer and retrieved a parcel wrapped in heavy brown paper. "While you were tending to your patients these past days, I consulted with a technician at the Royal College of Music. We reconstructed a fragment of the final roll into an audible playback." He unwrapped the parcel and produced a phonograph cylinder. "The result is unusual," Holmes said. "It begins with a spoken phrase, again in Sir Felix's synthesized voice. But then there's a musical bridge, a simple melodic passage, brief, no more than 20 seconds. And within that music, something odd." He placed the cylinder into our own phonograph and turned the crank. The device sputtered to life. A click, a hiss. Then Sir Felix's composed tones. "You have heard my name. You have heard my guilt. Now hear the truth neither history nor justice would inscribe." Then music. A quiet melody played slowly on piano, simple, almost lullaby-like. I might have dismissed it as filler, but Holmes leaned in, eyes narrowing. "Again," he said when it ended. Listen closely to the last 5 notes. He replayed the segment, then struck the same notes on our pianoforte, slowly. Then he did it again, but this time he translated each note into a corresponding letter using a simple cipher I recognized from a previous case. It was a form of cryptographic notation often used in musical circles during the early part of the century. He played D, G, A, C, E. He wrote D, G, A, C, E. Then he reversed the sequence, E, C, A, G, D, and rearranged the pattern until it spelled C, A, D, E, G. He paused. Not a word in itself, but perhaps a key. He took a sheaf of the pamphlets Jean-Paul had anonymously distributed, the poetic essays we'd reviewed together, and rifled through the final one. At the very bottom of the last page, in type so small I had previously missed it, was a single line in French. Ce que tu cherches est caché dans le silence des murs. What you seek is hidden in the silence of the walls. Holmes stood at once. Come, Watson, I know where it is. Where what is? The final confession, he said. Not the performative one. Not the voice of a father reconstructed. The real document. Something Jean-Paul concealed. Perhaps not even to be found unless every note was followed. We made for Clerkenwell immediately, back to number 13 Ludlow Crescent. The house had remained empty since Sir Felix's death, watched over by an agency on behalf of the estate. Holmes gained us entry with a letter of consent he had evidently procured earlier. Straight to the parlour he went, to the pianoforte, and then to the wall behind it. He knocked 3 times, then again, this time slightly higher, until a faint difference in tone caught his ear. He removed his gloves and pressed against a panel in the wainscoting. A soft click. The wood gave way. Inside the narrow recess was a single envelope, heavy parchment, no seal. Holmes opened it carefully. Inside a letter, written by Sir Felix Simon in his own hand. To the boy I never named, you are the truest consequence of my silence. I believe the cost of acknowledgement too great, the disruption too profound. I believed wrong. There is no justice in a life that conceals itself from truth. I chose comfort. You chose voice. You were the braver man. If this reaches you, know that I never doubted your mind. Only my own strength to face it. Holmes said nothing for a long moment. Then he folded the letter and placed it back in its envelope. We will deliver this to him ourselves, he said at last. And so, as night fell on London again, we returned to Jean-Paul Simon, not as pursuers of a case, but as messengers, not of justice nor of law, but of something Holmes rarely uttered aloud. Redemption. We arrived at the infirmary in the late evening. The sky pressed close above London like the dark lid of a box, wind rattling the window panes with a brittle persistence. Holmes said little during the cab ride. The envelope bearing Sir Felix's hand-written letter sat in his coat pocket, its weight greater than its contents. In my time beside Holmes, I had seen him uncover forgeries, expose conspiracies, even bring monarchs to heel. But this quiet delivery of a father's words to the son he had wronged, seemed to move him more than any of it. Jean-Paul Simon was sitting up when we entered. He looked markedly changed from our last meeting. The tension in his shoulders had softened, the guarded mask he wore in our presence before now lowered, if only slightly. There was no fear in his expression, nor pride, only something I might have called waiting, a stillness one sees in those who have thrown the final stone and now await the ripple. I thought you wouldn't come again, he said. His voice had a quiet edge, as though rehearsed inwardly for hours. Holmes didn't speak at once. He withdrew the envelope and set it gently on the side table beside Jean-Paul's bed. There was something else, Holmes said, hidden in the house at Ludlow Crescent, not meant to be found by law or by accident. Something buried until the final note was played. Jean-Paul regarded the envelope with wary disbelief. What is it? A letter, Holmes said. written by your father, in his own hand, addressed to you." Jean-Paul did not move. "You're certain?" "I am," Holmes said. "Though it was never sent nor shared. It was hidden behind the parlor wall where the piano stood. Buried, but not destroyed." Jean-Paul reached for the envelope slowly, almost hesitantly, as if unsure whether he wished to possess it at all. His fingers hovered above it before he finally lifted the flap and unfolded the parchment. Silence reigned for several minutes. Holmes stepped back, allowing the man his moment. Jean-Paul read the letter, twice, his lips barely moving. When he reached the final line, his eyes did not well with tears, nor did his face crumple into any visible grief. Instead, he simply exhaled, deep, long, as though the act of breathing had finally returned to him. He looked up at Holmes. "He wrote this before?" "I believe so," Holmes said. "I suspect he penned it some time ago, possibly after your final letter to him. Perhaps even after he read your mother's final plea. I believe it was meant to be hidden, not out of shame, but out of helplessness. He lacked the courage to give it to you, but he could not bring himself to destroy it either." Jean-Paul folded the letter and set it beside him on the bed. He leaned back into the pillow and stared at the ceiling. "Do you think I killed him?" he asked softly. Holmes answered without hesitation. "Number, I think you startled a ghost into letting go of a life it no longer knew how to carry. His death was the final consequence of choices made long before you were born. You did not kill him. You summoned the truth to stand before him. That is all." Jean-Paul closed his eyes for a long moment. "Will you give the scroll to the public?" "No," Holmes said, "unless you wish it." Jean-Paul's eyes opened again, and now they were tired, but steadier. It served its purpose. "My father heard it. I heard it. You heard it. That is enough." Holmes nodded. "Then it remains sealed." "I suppose you've solved every part of this," Jean-Paul said, his voice quiet but tinged with something almost like rueful amusement. "Every cipher, every metaphor." "Not every part," Holmes replied. "Only those you chose to make visible." "And the rest?" Holmes stepped closer, his gaze intense but not unkind. "I believe you staged a confession because you feared you'd never hear one. But I also believe you left clues, not to be found by Lestrade, nor by a jury, but by someone who could understand what you were truly doing." Jean-Paul said nothing. "You wrote a sonata in silence," Holmes added. "I was merely the ear tuned to its key." The room fell quiet again. Then, almost tentatively, Jean-Paul said, "I thought I might never know whether it mattered. Whether anything I did pierced through the indifference." Holmes turned toward the door. "It mattered. Perhaps not as justice, perhaps not as vengeance, but as truth. And truth, once heard, even in silence, does not fade." We left him then. As we stepped outside into the chilled air, I glanced back only once to see Jean-Paul reading the letter again, his expression no longer angry nor haunted, but contemplative, whole, perhaps, in a way he had never been before. The ride back to Baker Street was quiet, though the fog had lifted at last, revealing a starlit sky above the glistening rooftops of London. Holmes was uncharacteristically subdued, gazing out the window without a word, until we reached our door. Inside, he poured us each a small glass of brandy. He didn't toast. He simply sat, the fire crackling between us. "I've always admired logic, Watson," he said at last. "Its purity, its elegance, the way it cuts through human confusion like a scalpel." "And yet," I said, "this case was filled with ambiguity." Holmes looked into the fire. "Yes, and for once I think ambiguity was the correct answer. There was no crime to prosecute, only a silence to be understood." He took a small sip of the brandy, then added, "We search for patterns, clues, footprints, fibers. But sometimes what we're meant to find is not what was left behind, but what was never said aloud." I said nothing. I only sat back and let the warmth of the fire do its work. A week later, Jean-Paul Simon was quietly discharged. He left no address, gave no destination, and made no effort to return to Maison Verdure. But some time afterward, an unmarked envelope arrived at Baker Street. Inside was a short note written in a careful, spare hand. "You were right to listen. I have chosen to write no more, but I have chosen to live." J.P.S. Holmes read it once, then tucked it into the back of his violin case, where he kept only the rarest things: fragments of music, a letter from his brother, and a pressed flower I had never asked about. That evening, as I prepared to retire, I heard him take out the violin. He did not play his usual impromptu improvisations, nor any known composition. Instead, he drew the bow gently across the strings and played, note for note, the melody we had first heard on the pianoforte in Sir Felix's parlour. La Sonnerie du Soir, a slow, solemn tune. But in Holmes's hands it did not sound mournful. It sounded like a farewell that did not end in silence. The final piece fell into place, not with a thunderclap, but with a murmur. A week had passed since Jean-Paul Simon vanished quietly from London's view. The scroll remained sealed in the ministry's secure archive, at Holmes's request, accompanied by a single-page memorandum, unsigned, stipulating that it was not to be opened without just cause. Lestrade, in a moment of rare reflection, had agreed. The Yard, after all, had no appetite for scandal without a body or a motive to prosecute, and yet Holmes remained restless. It was on the morning of the 8th day that he rose abruptly from his chair, where he had spent the better part of 2 hours simply gazing at a scattering of paper rolls and musical staves, and declared, "It still doesn't sit right, Watson." I looked up from my breakfast. What doesn't? The letter, the hidden letter from Sir Felix. He paced to the window, hands clasped behind his back. Its tone, its wording, too polished, too symmetrical. It read like an ending composed for the reader's satisfaction rather than the writer's catharsis. I blinked. "You're suggesting Jean-Paul forged it?" "No," Holmes said. "I'm suggesting he found it, exactly as we did, but perhaps too easily." He turned, eyes sharp again. "He hid nothing in that wall. Someone else did, and that someone wasn't Sir Felix." I set down my teacup slowly. "Then who?" "Jean-Paul's mother." The words dropped like pebbles into a quiet pond. Holmes moved swiftly now, retrieving the original letter and several of Clémence Simon's past writings, including her musical scores and preserved letters, many of which Holmes had copied or obtained during his visit to Maison Verdure. "There, observe the calligraphy," Holmes said, spreading them on the desk beside the recovered envelope. "Do you see it, Watson? The shape of the loop in the F, the downward pressure on the R, the absence of serif tails in this." I leaned closer. It was subtle, but now that he said it, I could see it. The letter to Jean-Paul, though ostensibly written in a man's upright, formal script, bore traits more often found in Clémence's own hand. Holmes continued, "It was a final kindness. She found the letter Sir Felix ought to have written, and when he died before speaking, she composed it herself. She placed it in the wall behind the piano, where her son would eventually search, because she knew he would come, and that what he most needed, more than vengeance, was a father's acknowledgement." I stared at the letter with new understanding. Then it was a forgery, in form, but not in spirit. Precisely. Holmes sat, the tension releasing from his frame. In a way, it was the only real act of justice this case produced. Not from the courts, nor the police, nor even from me, but from a woman who understood that silence could wound deeper than judgment, and that a carefully placed word could heal more than any confession shouted from the rooftops. The fire crackled between us. "And Jean-Paul?" I asked. "He will never know," Holmes said, or perhaps he suspected, even as he read it. But it gave him peace. And that was the point. The truth is often composed of partial lies stitched together with intent. And sometimes, rarely, it is better left unexamined. He stood and moved to the window once more. Outside, the fog was clearing, unveiling the familiar silhouette of London, the city of secrets, of faceless crowds and veiled reputations. "We live in a time," he said softly, "where reputation is currency, and justice is a performance staged in chambers far from the eyes of those it serves." Jean-Paul tried to disrupt that stage, but in the end, what brought resolution was not revelation, but mercy. I looked across the room at the violin resting in its case. "You played the song again that night," I said. "La sonnerie du soir." "I did," Holmes said, "and I heard something I'd missed." He picked up the instrument now and turned it in his hands. "In that melody, there is no crescendo, no sharp turn. It drifts downward, softly, deliberately, until it lands not in dissonance, but in quiet." He raised the violin, set the bow. He played the final phrase again. 4 slow notes, then one held in stillness. The room was quiet when he lowered the instrument. "The case is closed," he said, "and for once, I do not intend to reopen it." And so it ended, not with a charge read aloud or a villain unmasked in some gaslit drawing room, but with a choice. A song played in silence, a letter written in love, and the most elusive conclusion of all in Holmes's long career, an unfinished truth, left to rest, 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 left to rest.